Hey guys, today's screencast we're going to explore what the implications are of a human-induced global climate change or disruption. So far we've looked at the structure of our atmosphere, we've looked at the mechanism of the greenhouse effect, and we've looked at also the causes of human-induced climate change. So let's get into what the consequences are. To be fair, obviously a warmer world for some people might actually be a good thing. Some locations may experience increased tourism as a result of perhaps experiencing more tropical conditions. Some locations may have actually increased productivity, perhaps as a result of increased precipitation. Although, for the most part, most of the outcomes of this warming world will be negative. And here's a list of some of the major implications. Right, first on the list, as you can see, is melting ice. Okay, so the world's getting warmer, ice is melting. So what happens when ice melts? First of all, when ice melts, the albedo of the Earth changes. Albedo really is it's a measurement of the reflectivity of the Earth. And right now at the poles, with all of the Arctic ice and the ice caps and the continental and alpine glaciers, the albedo of the Earth is very reflective. In fact, about 90% of the incoming solar radiation hits the ice and is reflected back out into space. Well, that keeps the Arctic somewhat cool. However, as that ice continues to melt because of atmospheric warming, the albedo decreases, and therefore more of that incoming solar radiation gets absorbed as you start changing the color of Earth's surface. As more ice melts, the white reflective colors get transformed into darker colors, where the water is now exposed to the atmosphere and absorbs more of that incoming solar radiation. So what is really happening is the Arctic regions of the world are warming at least twice as fast as other locations. And when that starts to warm, it creates what we call positive feedback loops, because now the Earth is warming. As the Earth warms, more ice melts, and therefore reflectivity of Earth's surface decreases, causing more ice to melt in the future. And so this is sort of a vicious cycle where warming leads to further warming. Likewise, we know in the permafrost, those permanently frozen layers of the soil in the Arctic are melting, and of course incorporated in that permafrost are methane hydrates. Now, as the ice melts in the permafrost, some of that methane is being released to the atmosphere. So more methane being released, which is of course another greenhouse gas, leads to more warming. More warming leads to more melting, and so we have yet another positive feedback loop. All right, so melting ice is an issue. Of course, one major consequence of that melting ice is the rise in global sea levels. Now, I think it's important to note, though, that it depends on the ice we're talking about, right? Because icebergs and Arctic, sea caps or ice caps over the ocean really aren't going to contribute to a rise in global sea levels, right? Because ultimately that ice melts and it doesn't really displace the amount of water below it as it melts. It just melts into a liquid form. On the other hand, when you look at continental glaciers, so this is ice propped up on the land, or alpine glaciers that are also found on the land, when that melts and runs off the land into the ocean, well, now that's going to contribute to a greater volume of water in our ocean basins, and therefore sea levels rise. That's not the only reason that sea levels rise, though, because as water warms, it results in what we call thermal expansion. And the oceans and the water, like anything when heated, expand. And when it expands, it increases the volume and therefore contributes to a raising of global sea levels. Now, for those locations located along the coast with fairly low elevations, they are going to be susceptible to this coastal flooding. And of course, we know many populations are centered along the coast. And for those nations that are fairly undeveloped and don't have the capacity to perhaps mitigate the effects of coastal flooding, well, it's going to create ultimately millions of environmental refugees. And so that's going to cause all sorts of, political instability and chaos and economic turmoil. Aside from the flooding and rising sea levels, another issue that certainly affects coastal areas is the increased storm intensity and frequency. Right? We know hurricanes are the product of very warm surface ocean water. They typically form in the Atlantic off the coast of Africa, and they need this sort of bath water of 80 degrees in order for that water to evaporate and create unstable atmospheric conditions. So as you start to warm surface water and it increases, it's going to increase evaporation, and storms will not only increase in their frequency, but they become more intense as well. And of course, this is problematic because now as these hurricanes move into the Gulf of Mexico, and that surface water is like a really warm bath water, the intensity and frequency of those storms increases as well. What's kind of interesting is that while some places experience greater storms and greater flooding and so forth, other locations will experience greater drought. So, yeah, all right, there's going to be more evaporation coming off the oceans in areas where there's large bodies of water. But when temperatures warm over the land, ultimately, instead of creating more precipitation, it's going to be pulling more of that water out of the soil. And so evaporation will exceed precipitation and cause drought in many locations. Other issues include increased disease. We know many vectors for disease, such as mosquitoes with malaria, tend to enjoy tropical climates. And as these climates expand northwards and more stagnant bodies of water with warmer temperatures exist, these diseases will in fact spread. Ecosystems will shift. There's sort of going to be a poleward migration of warmer locations, and with certain species that have a very narrow window or a narrow range of tolerance for different temperatures, they're going to be exposed to these changing conditions and may succumb to those changing conditions. Animals might be able to migrate, but let's face it, trees and plants don't migrate very quickly. So these shifting ecosystems ultimately can lead to species extinction, right? And that's why when we talk about the HIPCO acronym, the letter C is a very important factor in contributing to species loss. All right, well, that's it for the implications, and we'll discuss these in greater detail.